Hello everyone, we are from Group 10 and we are going to show you our video about the explanation of attitudes and applications. For today's material, we are going to talk about these four main subtopics, starting from attitudes to language, overt and covert prestige, attitude to standard English, and lastly, attitudes to vernacular forms of English, including AAVE, vernacular forms of English users and context, and a note to methodology. But before we start, I would like to introduce myself. My name is Dieva Oktaviary and my student number is 109 and I'll be the first speaker. The first subtopic is about attitudes to language. So what is actually called an attitude in language learning? Language attitudes are opinions, ideas, beliefs, and prejudices that speakers have within language in general, their language, and the language of other people. Have you ever noticed someone who talks using a language that you consider strange and weird? Your judgment about certain language is what a sociolinguist called as an attitude. People's opinion toward language are highly based on the one who speaks the language and the context in which they are associated. According to Holmes, people generally find it easier to understand language and to learn about certain dialects spoken by people they like or admire. For example, British people most likely dislike anyone who speaks a different language other than English. They even consider it as odd. But then, they being fans of Asian artists who speaks different language than them, BTS for instance, who is worldwide famous, their attitude will change. They don't even consider Korean as odd anymore since they like it. That is why attitude really depends on someone who uses the language. Moving on, we are going to talk about varieties of attitudes to language. Just like everything in life, there will always be a positive and negative thought or attitudes toward language. In sociolinguistics, there are three main aspects that people deeply consider before showing their attitudes, whether they want to give a positive or negative attitude. The first one is pleasant versus unpleasant, whether the language is like music to their ear, which is really good to hear, or absolutely bad. For example, Spanish, Italian, Korean, and Japanese are considered beautiful and pleasant languages, as we know that anime, K-pop, and Spanish local series like Money Heist have a million viewers. Because people enjoy listening to that language even though they don't really know the meaning, they show their positive attitude towards them. Meanwhile, based on international vote on the internet, Russian is chosen to be the least pleasant language to hear. That is why people give a negative attitude toward Russian. The second one is highly prestigious versus no prestige at all. French and British English are successfully called as highly prestigious language because people think that any speakers who speak using those two languages will look incredibly classy, prestigious, and posh at the same time. On the contrary, American, African, and Australian English doesn't have any prestige at all because it is considered quite ordinary. If we take a look into our own country, Indonesia, Jakartan language, including their slangs like lo gue, regarded as a cool languages. People will compete to talk like them. Meanwhile, any other regional language in Indonesia is not that hype as Jakartan language. And the third one is intelligent versus dumb, whether the speaker of the language will look exceptionally intelligent or really dumb and ridiculous if they speak using certain language. For example, the speakers of English, Chinese, and part of European languages like German and Dutch considered highly intelligent because of the language that they spoke. Those four languages are regarded as a language that is quite hard to learn. That is why most people adore and give a positive attitude to anyone who speaks using those languages and portray them as highly intellectual people. On the other hand, most language from Asian countries, especially Hindi, Vietnamese, and Thai, or nowadays called as Chinese, are considered as ridiculous and dumb to hear to. People think that those two languages are quite funny to listen to. In the end, what we really need to know is there is no universal consensus of people's attitude towards certain language, because attitudes are subjective. Each person will not have the same attitudes to certain language. That is why we cannot judge all language the same. This is the end of the first subtopic explanation. The next subtopic will be presented by the second speaker.
Overt and covert prestige. Covert prestige. It involves two contradictory ideas. How can something have prestige if its value is not publicly recognized? Covert prestige refers to positive attitudes towards vernacular or non-standard speech varieties. The varieties are used by people, yet when people are asked to comment on them, they rarely admit to valuing them, at least to strangers. Despite their official protestations, people clearly do in fact value vernacular varieties. There is also a large group of people who are not aware that they do not speak with the accent they admire and regard as the standard. Overt prestige. The standard variety in a community has overt prestige. Speakers who use the standard variety are rated highly on scale of educational and occupational status. It is generally identified as a model of good speech by all sections of the community. Received pronunciation, or RP, is the example of the overt prestige accent. The example of the covert prestige is this one. A teacher doesn't like one of her students, a West Indian teenager, to use English with Manchester accent, and she called it as non-proper English. The student also used Jamaican Creole or Patois. She called the Patois a sloppy and ugly speech. In fact, the Patois, the Jamaican Creole, is a language variety with a complex grammar, distinctive pronunciations, and distinctive vocabulary. The Patois retains covert prestige since few black people admit to outsiders that proficiency in this variety is greatly admired. Overtly negative attitudes towards their speech reflect the depressed social position of West Indian people in Britain rather than features of the language varieties they use.
So, hello everyone, today I'm Zhalsa Altanis M.R. and my number is 089. Today I'm going to present about attitudes to Standard English and RP. So, Standard English has an enormous legacy of over prestige. It has been regarded as a symbol of British nationhood, while vernacular dialects of English are downgraded. Since that, many people are surprised to find that standard accents of English are so highly regarded by those who don't use the language. This is clearly illustrated by relation to RP in England. When people are asked to assess RP speakers on tape, they rate them as more intelligent, industrious, self-confident, and entitlement than regional accented speakers. RP is rated ahead of all other accents on such criteria as communicative effectiveness, social status, and general pleasantness. People who use RP accents are often taken more seriously, and RP speakers are more likely to persuade people to cooperate. And for RP speaking women, they have many benefits. They will be rated as more competent, less weak, more independent, adventurous, and more feminine than non-RP speakers. Even outside Britain, RP is still an overtly admired model in many countries where English is used, such as Singapore and New Zealand. While attitudes to local varieties is varied, RP often has a guaranteed place among acceptable prestige forms. For example, many New Zealand teenagers in the 80s and 90s rated RP more highly than any New Zealand accent since British regional accents began to develop. Even though, at first, RP is rarely accepted by society, as they called New Zealand English as an objectionable colonial dialect, subsequently the New Zealand accent was described as indefensible, corrupt, degraded, and even hideous and evil sounding. But on the other hand, while RP tends to be rated highly on the status dimension, as in Britain, local accents generally score more highly on characteristics such as friendliness and sense of humor, and other dimensions which measure solidarity or social attractiveness. This evidence of the covert prestige of regional accents and vernacular varieties is discussed further in the next session by my friend.
Going back with me, Dieva Oktaviary, and I will explain about the next subtopics, which is attitudes to vernacular forms of English. Within these subtopics, we will discuss three different aspects, namely African American Vernacular English, or we call it as AAVE, vernacular forms of English users and context, and lastly, a note to methodology. The first one is African American Vernacular English that we call AAVE. AAVE is the one of the varieties of English that used to be called as vernacular Black English among sociolinguists since the users mostly are Black people. For more than a decade, AAVE has been underestimated by the society, not only from the western part of the globe, but also from the eastern part as well, like Asia. Most people give such a bad response and bad attitudes to AAVE. And why is that? Well, there are two main reasons why people give harsh criticisms and prejudices towards AAVE. The first one is that AAVE is considered as a low language because it is such a rare thing to find any source of entertainment like movies, TV shows, or songs that use AAVE. The recent analysis also reveals that the only Disney movie that uses AAVE is the character from The Jungle Book and The Lion King, that more or less represent animal rather than humans. The second one is that there is prejudice that says, if you use AAVE, you won't get a good job. The reason that kind of prejudices exist in the society is mainly because they think the one who uses AAVE is not intelligent enough. Ethnicity discrimination and racism are playing the important roles for this such of barbaric prejudice that will spread in the society. Even though AAVE is struck by a lot of negative comments, many successful African Americans assert the importance of maintaining and giving status to AAVE. They even resist the attempts by the majority of people and groups to impose SAE or South African English on everyone, because it seems like a betrayal of their home dialect to many African Americans.
Next, vernacular forms of English, users, and context. The standard dialect is primarily a socially defined entity, not a linguistically defined one. Standard English is the English used by educated people with relatively high social status, generally referred to as the middle class. So, middle class children speak Standard English, and children from other social groups do not. These standard forms are commonly spoken in formal contexts, like school and a law court, while the vernacular forms are used in more casual contexts, such as the playground and the home.
So there are three main ways that people have used to collect information on attitudes to language. The first one is societal treatment. So in here, sociolinguists can infer attitudes by observing the way language is used in the public domain. A wide variety of materials can be used for this purpose. There are lots of examples regarding the first method. The first one is government documents can provide information on the status of different languages, such as educational documents can give clues about teachers' view toward students' language. The second example is employment advertisement can indicate which languages or varieties of a language are favored by employers. The third example is the representation of dialect. In novels, it is another source of attitudinal information. In here, less well-educated people are often represented as using vernacular grammar and strong regional accents. And the last example is from cartoons. Cartoons often parody of these preferred language features, and they can provide useful insights on societal stereotypes. For instance, provide information on how society views aspects of male-female interaction. And how does this method work? So, people regularly express views about language use on the radio, TV, net, and in the press. Sociolinguists record people's views and collect letters from the public in newspapers and magazines as evidence of people's attitudes to language. They provide one kind of evidence about attitudes to language. Then they can provide useful clues to language changes in progress and suggest areas for further study. But then this way has a weakness, which is though data collected in this way is carefully adequate for a sociolinguist to come to definitive conclusion about how widely such attitudes are shared, it can provide interesting indication of the range of attitudes held in a community, so that observation can be a good starting point for research and a useful source of information about some aspects of attitudes to language, but it is rarely provides a representative picture of how widely held such views are. And for the second method is direct measures. In here, sociolinguists can ask direct questions about people's attitude to particular languages or language varieties or even linguistic features. For instance, do you like the Welsh language? Do you think Welsh sounds beautiful? Do you like the sound at the beginning of the Welsh word language? And these questions just need yes or no answer, and it is easy to cut, so you can collect answers from large numbers of people using a written questionnaire or an interview schedule, and then count the responses easily. Written questionnaires can be anonymous and they can even be sent out to large numbers of people by post, thus assessing a large sample of the community. And another way of this method is you can ask kind of questions such as, what do you think of the way the Queen of England speaks? What are your views about African American vernacular English? And what do you think about the pronunciation axe for axe? And to answer this question requires some analysis. They need to be categorized at least into those which are for and against, and as a result it is less easy to make a conclusion about people's view, but they also offer the possibility of eliciting richer and more interesting data. And there is a disadvantage of this method. The disadvantage of this method is that people may not reveal their true attitudes, especially if they feel that their views are unacceptable in the wider community. For example, if they secretly admire or hate Maori or Sinhalese or AAVE, they may not admit this to an interviewer who appears to represent a group unsympathetic to their views. Other than that, the age, ethnicity, gender, and social background of the interviewer may also influence people's responses in this way. Anonymous questionnaires can help in resolving such dilemmas, but the response ratios to written questionnaires tend to be very low, and the people who respond are often those with a particular board to push. So the results will not be representative of the views of the community as a whole. For instance, students in literature are often asked to respond to such questionnaires because they provide a captive and usually cooperative audience, but their results present the same problem. They are hardly representative of the wider community. And the last one is indirect measures. In here, the method is to elicit the respondents' attitudes without making them feel self-conscious or embarrassed. Typically, listeners hear tapes of two people saying the same thing but speaking in two different languages or two different varieties. The listeners are unaware that the first samples they hear are produced by just two speakers. Then, they are asked to evaluate the personality of the speakers rather than the language variety itself. Since the personality of the speaker is constant for the pairs of voices, this cannot in principle be an influence on the responses. So, attitudes to language and its user and use are intertwined. People's responses inevitably tell us something about their attitudes to the language. There is a weakness of this method, which is it is obviously that this approach doesn't keep the personality of the speakers constant, but the problems that have been identified relate not so much to variation in the personality of speakers, but rather to the problem of getting speakers who sound equally fluent and confident. Stutters and hesitation have a huge influence on people's judgment, so getting data which is truly comparable is a major challenge for this methodology. And from the previous explanation, there is a question, why is shared attitude important? Social dialectologists have claimed that shared attitudes to speech or shared speech norms are the crucial criteria in defining members of the same speech community. And it is important because attitudes to language have implications in many social spheres and illustrate well the ways in which sociolinguistic research often has an applied dimension. For instance, attitudes to vernacular varieties or the languages of these favorite groups affect many teachers' academic expectations of those who use these varieties, with implications for their academic progress. And another example is on the way people speak affect employers' decision about who to hire. Thank you.
This is the end of Group 10 presentation. Thank you so much for watching. We hope you guys understand the video clearly. All sorts of comments will be appreciated. And that's all from us. Once again, thank you and goodbye.